October 26th. We are in San Francisco in a dirty-smelling and stifling little one-room apartment. We are both filthy after so many miserable hours on the bus, and since Chris is taking her bath down the hall, I will write a few lines till it is my turn. I'm sure we have enough money to last us till we get jobs, because I kept the $130 I was supposed to turn into Bastard Richie, and Chris was able to draw out the $400+ she had in the bank. This whoring little spider hole we are in costs $90 for the month, but at least that will give us enough time to get jobs and look for a decent place to live. I feel dreadful about my parents, but at least they know I'm with Chris, and they think she is a nice and respectable girl who won't lead me astray. Boy, how much farther astray could I go? That scintillating passage is from this book, Go Ask Alice, by Anonymous, but actually it's by Beatrice Sparks, and I will get into that as I go on. This was Ollie's pick for the birth year book reading challenge for the month of August, in time for Garb August, and as I said in my previous video, this was a perfect candidate because this is a piece of fucking garbage. So I'm sure everybody knows about this book, right? I mean, it says right there, more than 4 million copies sold. I actually looked it up, and apparently more recently, in 2009, that number had climbed to 5 million. Everybody's at least heard of this book, I think, right? The classic cautionary tale of a girl who gets into drugs, which is purported to be based on a real diary, as it says there, a real diary. And I guess in the sense that it reflects its author, in that it reads like something that was written by a middle-aged Mormon woman. Yeah, sure, it's definitely very real on that front. It was very convincing. As an actual piece of literature and as a convincing piece of anti-drug propaganda, it's fucking awful. So the narrator is anonymous, obviously, but we'll just call her Alice just to make things simpler. It even refers to her as Alice on the back there. You'll never be able to forget Alice. I wish I could forget Alice. So this is kind of the anti-drug screed. So many people know about this. So many kids have read this. It's been passed around in schools. It's been frequently challenged. It's everywhere. But I'd never actually read it, and Ollie's challenge was a good excuse to. So this is about a girl named who we'll call Alice. You know, she's a good little girl. She's a good little 15-year-old girl. She's so pure and innocent and good-hearted, and she just wants boys to like her. And then she ends up getting into drugs when someone she goes to a party where someone spikes a bunch of Coke bottles with LSD. She has a really pleasant trip, and that just leads her on this slippery slope to drug addiction. So obviously, drug addiction, it's a very real, important issue. It's something that should be handled realistically, sensitively, and honestly. And this book does not do any of those. As a chronicle of drug addiction, it's the most unbelievable bullshit I've ever read in my life. Within 2 days of getting high on acid accidentally, she's having speed injected into her arm, and she's doing all this other crazy shit, and then she thinks about oh, I'd like to try pot, and then about a month later she's doing pot for the first time. And it's that progression doesn't make any sense to me. She's going from LSD to speed to uppers and downers to pot. I don't believe that for a second. Especially, I can understand, a teenage girl, experimenting and things like that. I mean, that happens, but, just getting into injectable drugs within 2 fucking days, and then it continues on where of course she ends up running away from home and joining in with this group of druggies in some place. It's not San Francisco, but it's just some anonymous town. The author's attempts at fucking writing believable teenage dialogue is the worst fucking shit imaginable. You heard a little bit of that in that excerpt, but in the beginning of the book, before she gets into drugs, she writes like she's a 17th century woman who's being married off. I just bought the most wonderful little single pearl pin for Mother's Christmas present. It's a cultured pearl, which means it's real and it looks like my mom. Oh, I hope she likes it. There's so much of that in the book, how I despair, or oh, I hope she likes it, or oh, if only I could do this. And then when she gets into drugs, she's talking about, she's using slang, and it's just the most unbelievable slang I've ever heard in my life. Oh, yeah, man, she's saying bummer and man and and groovy and all this stuff, and it just reeks of a 50-year-old woman trying so hard to write like a teenager. I know this is published in 1971, and some of that slang was contemporary, groovy and stuff like that, but just the way it's utilized is just so unbelievable. Of course, as a sign of her sort of moral degradation, she starts cursing a lot, and it reads like someone who's like learned about cursing for the first time but doesn't know how to apply it properly, which I guess could be believable for a 15-year-old girl, but just the way it's executed is so bad. There's like one entry where like the whole paragraph it's like every other sentence is like god damn and shitty, or it gets into really weird like modes of cursing that I've never even heard before in my life, like that this bejesus weather and stuff like that. It's so unbelievable. It's so stupid, and she gets so addicted to drugs within like the space of like a month or two. She's like selling drugs to like children. There's a literal scene where a 9-year-old child buys drugs from her in a schoolyard, and like I'm not saying that's not possible, but really, like in this like affluent suburban neighborhood, like a 9-year-old kid buying drugs, like I mean, I was a pretty sheltered 9-year-old kid, but that just seems very unbelievable to me. And of course, another sign of her moral degradation and the people and the moral degradation of the people that she gets involved with is that some of them are gay. There's this guy she meets named Richie who's like a college kid, and he's like she like sells drugs for him, and she's like all in love with him, blah blah blah. And then her and her friend Chris like find him sleeping with his roommate, and of course, and there's all this like really horrible stuff about him being like a queer and being a homo and all this stuff. And of course, like it's meant to be like shocking, where it's like oh, like the depravity that these drug addicted people will sink to. There's like several like predatory lesbian characters in the book, like older women who sort of like prey on the young girls and like get them to like sell drugs, or they like assault them and stuff like that. And it's just so unbelievably offensive and insensitive, especially in regards to sexual assault. Like there's one part where Alice, she gets like really fucked up on drugs, and both her and her friend Chris are assaulted by this woman that Chris works for and her partner. She's just like, oh yeah, I guess that happened. She just like brushes it off. There's no underlying trauma or anything like that. The sort of degradation of her life, all these things that she's subjected to, are just sort of treated like it's the next day of the week. And I'm not saying that of course you can't become desensitized to things, but this is her first time experiencing something like this. Like yes, she's into drugs, but she's not this invulnerable, cynical, old soul. I mean, she's been into drugs for like what, 5-6 months maybe? Like, and in regards to like the actual effects of like assault and abuse and things like that, especially among people who are into drugs and young people who are into drugs, it was just so insensitive and stupid, and it's just the most phony piece of garbage that I've ever read. And like the pacing is fucking weird. I know it's supposed to be a real diary, and like diaries aren't beholden to like literary conventions, but if that's true, then why is she writing like she's writing all these long sort of like erudite like passages at times. Like she'll go from like being very like straightforward to being like, I did this today, I did that today, and then she'll be like, it's Christmas, wonderful, magnificent, happy, holy Christmas. Goodbye, dear house dressed in your holiday finery of tinsel and holly and bright-colored lights. I love you. I'll miss you. She'll like jump from events like with like no in between. Like she'll be like oh, like I'm finally feeling good. I'm feeling better, and then like the very next entry will be like 3 days later, and she'll be like, life sucks. Assuming that this is supposed to be a real teenage girl's diary, you would think that she would write about kind of her daily life, her interactions with people, sort of her worries, her foibles, talking about boys she likes, and there is a little bit of that, but she glosses over a lot of stuff, and like in parts where it doesn't even really make sense, and then but then when she's like describing her drug trips, she goes into like the excruciating detail about like how it felt and stuff, and with all this like flowery language. There's just no seam connecting any of it, and there's just overall this kind of like sanctimonious vibe to it, where there's all this stuff about how like, oh, like I must obey my parents, and I must make my grandparents proud of me, and oh, my family loves me, and they do everything they can for me, and I was wrong to feel this way about them, and I should just obey them in everything they do. I'm so lucky. She runs off like 3 times in the book for no apparent reason. Like she just does drugs and then decides to run off. That's the thing. Like you would think in a diary like this, if she's planning to make these like big decisions to like run away from home, she would like write about like her feelings as to why she ran off, what happened. But no, it'll be like May 6th, like I did this today, and then May 7th, I'm in San Francisco, and it's like, whoa, like when did that fucking happen? And she doesn't even talk about like why she decided to do it, like what the motivation was. She's just like, I'm in San Francisco now, and it's like, oh, okay, here we are, I guess. And while in San Francisco, she like meets meets this, I think it was in San Francisco, I can't remember. She runs away like 3 separate times to like a bunch of different places. But there's this one bit where she meets this priest, and she talks about like he's this priest who's like really tuned in to young people, and he convinced me to fix my erroneous ways. And then she like goes to the coffee shop where she hangs out with the other druggies, because of course it's a coffee shop. And she talks to this guy named, I think his name's Jeff, and she's like, oh, like I tried to convince, I told him about the priest and how he's trying to set people on the normal path, and I hope he goes. It's just there's just very much this kind of moral imperative of like, be a good girl and don't talk back to your parents and go to school and get married and have kids. It's just so gross and like moralistic and sanctimonious, and it's just fucking disgusting. And then on top of that, there's a fucking bullshit ending. They build it up, saying like, I'm going to be, she goes to a mental asylum, or she calls it a freak wharf. I've never fucking heard that term in my life. Have you? I haven't. But yeah, she goes to the freak wharf, and she spends a little while there, and then she starts to get better, and she comes home, and she's making all these promises to herself, like, I'm not gonna do drugs. I'm getting better. I'm gonna go to school. I'm gonna do all this, blah 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 blah. And she decides to give up writing in her diary because she's like, I don't need it anymore. And then there's this fucking terrible epilogue that's 3 paragraphs long. The subject of this book died 3 weeks after her decision not to keep another diary. Her parents came home from a movie and found her dead. They called the police and the hospital, but there was nothing anyone could do. Was it an accidental overdose? A premeditated overdose? No one knows, and in some ways that question isn't important. What must be of concern is that she died, and that she was only one of thousands of drug deaths that year. It's just like, there you go. That's it. That's the end of the book. And I get what they're trying to do. I get that they're probably trying to go for like a shock ending where you're like, oh man, like things are getting better. And then like, what? She died? But it's just so anticlimactic and so poorly done. It's almost like a slap in the face, really, where it's like, I'm getting better. And then this fucking terribly written epilogue, there was nothing they could do, just fucking hits you out of nowhere. And it's like, actually, she died. Fuck you, Oh, and there was this other thing that didn't make any fucking sense to me. She like comes back to her family, and she starts going back to school, and she doesn't want to like associate with like the druggy kids anymore, because obviously, and they start like bullying her for not wanting to be into drugs, and to the point where they're like harassing her and stuff, and like calling her names. To be fair, at one point she does rat someone out, so I guess I could understand people being having animosity about that, but like she doesn't report them to the police. She just tells their parents. She doesn't like get them in trouble. And then it culminates in this wild scene where the reason she ends up in the freak ward is because somehow the druggies like slip LSD into her ice cream or something, and she has this like full-on mental breakdown where she thinks like maggots are like eating her body, so she like claws up her face and stuff, and then she ends up going that's how she ends up going to the freak wharf. And I was just like, really? Like, are druggies, especially like high school age, kids who are into drugs, like that vindictive? I mean, I knew a few fucking druggies in high school, and like they were off doing drugs, doing their own thing. Like, are people who are drug addicted teenagers really that vindictive and fucking and flush with cash so that they can afford to waste their expensive drugs on this fucking random ass chick just because she went straight and like kind of ratted somebody out? It's just so ridiculous and so stupid. But of course, it's painting, this is the world of drug addicts. They're all like evil and horrible, and they're all vindictive and disgusting, and there's no sympathy, there's no humanity, there's no attempt to really understand the reality of addiction or to get to the heart of why she's addicted. She just gets into drugs, and it's like, they make me feel good. Okay, that's it. Oh, and another really fucked up thing is that when she gets off drugs, because it is accidental apparently, she's just able to get off drugs, and there's no mention of like withdrawals, of like freaking out. There's one scene where she has a flashback, but that's it. And other than that, there's no real talk about like withdrawal symptoms or like struggling with the physical realities of addiction, of the craving. It's just so unrealistic and so stupid and so sanctimonious and just ridiculous. I don't know how people thought this shit was real. This is the most ridiculous, unrealistic, terrible piece of crap like propaganda that I've ever read in my life. I mean, I thought Crank was bad. This makes Crank look like a fucking masterpiece. This is a literary stillborn. This is fucking... I could fucking shit on some notebook paper and that would have more literary meaning than this god-awful piece of shit, crap, unrealistic, just awful, terrible book, and I fucking hated it. And when you look into it, it gets even more fucked up, because the author was indeed a middle-aged Mormon youth counselor who apparently was inspired by real people that she met, and then basically just milked that into literary fame. In fact, part of the reason that it was claimed that this was a real diary at first and it was published under an anonymous name was to deter any literary criticism. And then she wrote a follow-up book, Jay's Journal, which was about a young boy who gets into the occult, and he eventually kills himself. And that was actually she worked with the family of a real boy who actually had a lot of mental problems and killed himself. And apparently she just totally threw out the actual journal that this kid wrote. She used like 21 of the entries and just made up the rest herself. All the stuff about the occult and him being attacked by demons and shit, she just made up out of whole cloth, and then she just milked the hell out of it. And apparently the family was like really upset with her, and there was a whole big thing about it. I actually bought a book after reading this that just came out. So it's this book, Unmask Alice, LSD, Satanic Panic, and the Imposter Behind the World's Most Notorious Diaries by Rick Emerson. I think this just came out this month, and after reading this, I had to get this so I could kind of get the full story. And I also bought a copy of Jay's Journal because I really want to learn more about this fucking con artist who somehow tricked millions of people into thinking this was real, and I'm sure did absolutely nothing to get people off of drugs. The drug epidemic is still as bad as it was, and so really, in the long run, what did this piece of shit, this hunk of crap in the shape of a book, what did this do for anybody? Why did people think this was real? I know this is published in 1971, but Jesus Christ, this has the vibe of like an after-school special that's written with all the subtlety and nuance of a car accident. It's horrible. Thanks, Ollie, for picking this book. It was a great time. But no, seriously, like, I am, in a weird way, I am glad I read it. Just so that I can say, like, I've read it and now I know kind of what it is and where it's coming from, and I have a lot more to learn about in this fucked up, crazy story, this literary hoax. I don't even know what to say. Don't read this. Unless you really like torturing yourself. I mean, it's short, it's only 185 pages, it's a quick read. I read this in like 2 days. I would say, steer clear. If you have a loved one who's addicted to drugs and you want something that will help them kind of understand the realities of it, there's much better stuff out there. I mentioned in one of my previous videos, Last Night I Sang to the Monster, that was a great YA book about addiction. There's just so many options out there. You don't need this melodramatic, outdated, poorly written piece of literary garbage masquerading as truth, too. There is nothing truthful about this. There's nothing real about it. There's nothing honest. It's just lies and preaching and just awfulness. It's terrible. Please, don't read this. I suffered, so you don't have to. So yeah, that was Go Ask Alice. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, like, comment, and subscribe. I'm gonna go fucking bleach my eyes now. I'll see you guys later. Bye.